right. Stream health was a little low. We should be good. All right. Turn that down. Friday. Man, we're in October. Can you believe that? Halfway. We're at the halfway part at the end of today. So that's not too bad. In 2 weeks we have our next exam. So probably want to start reviewing what we've covered. C3, C4 cam plants. That is, let's see here. That's where we left off, and then the environmental variation, terrestrial environment. So that quiz was uploaded. I think I gave you until Monday, end of the day, to take that quiz. That'll give you time to go back and review the notes, get caught up. There is one thing I want to point out. I sent out an announcement on this. So here's our Blackboard page. What I've done, and I kind of meant to do it, and I didn't really even think about it, but I wanted to get the images, the figures that are in the presentations to you. So if you wanted to print them out and have them and slide them into your binder or your notebook, you can do that. So what you'll see is I've made the PDFs, and these are the figures that I had in that terrestrial environment presentation. It's not going to be anything that I put up on the board. I do think you can draw it. I mean, if I can draw it on the board, you can draw it on the board. And drawing it helps you kind of learn what the graph is showing, what the figure is trying to demonstrate, and so forth. So I have these up. This is for the terrestrial environment as well as the aquatic environment, which we start today. All right, so we had a question over, oh, hold on. Before I get to that question, also the lab. So our grasshopper lab is up. So this is grasshopper data simulation. I also have the confidence interval sheets. So you'll have access to that. That'll calculate 95% confidence intervals of our population estimates. But this is up. You can print it out. The last page, or the last 2 pages, is going to be completed. Kind of think through what we did, what happens when assumptions are violated, and so forth. So at least those last 2 pages are going to be what gets turned in. That is up. All right, so I had a question about, I think, the exam. Will it be cumulative? It won't cover the first stuff. So what was on the first exam was on the first exam. That'll reappear on the final exam. We picked up with the water stress. So we did adaptations to temperature. That was on exam 1. Exam 2 starts adaptation to water. And then we're talking about this environmental variation. And then we'll do intraspecific variation. So why do we have variation within the species, and what type of variation is preferred, genetic versus being plastic, phenotypically plastic, as well as estimating similarities between populations and so forth. And then once we finish that kind of marks a shift then to more populations. So we'll look at demography, describing populations, and so forth. So is it cumulative? No. Anything that we had on the first exam stayed on the first exam. All right, so we talked about terrestrial variation. We talked about the drivers of climate. So temperature and precipitation are what drive climate, and then you have that substrate that affects our ecosystems, affects our environment, right? And we kind of focused on the terrestrial system because that's kind of gives us a good introduction to, the effect of the sun and orbits and tilt of the Earth and so forth. A lot of that's still persist in the aquatic environment. So if we look at latitudinal gradients, those trends persist. If we go up to the poles, the water's going to be colder. If we're near the equator, the water's going to be warmer. And a lot of that, and again, is due to the solar radiation. How much heat is absorbed by the water, radiative heat. But there's a lot more exceptions to the aquatic systems because the water can move. And especially when we think about how much water is on the Earth, you realize that we kind of have to look at the aquatic systems by themselves to further understand them. All right, so what we're going to do is look at the variation. What are the causes of the variation in these aquatic systems? Water throughout the Earth is essentially divided among 7 different types of reservoirs, or 7 different types of holdings. All right, we have the atmosphere, so water in the atmosphere in the form of water vapor. We have ice, so frozen water. We have water in the oceans. We have water in the lakes and rivers and groundwater. And lastly, we have water that is in the soils themselves and haven't percolated down into the groundwater, or they haven't evaporated, and so forth. Water is going to move between all of these different reservoirs. How they move is described by the hydrologic cycle, the water cycle. All right, so the hydrologic cycle is defined as the movement of water among the living and non-living components of the Earth. That might be a little too big there. All right, so the hydrologic cycle is the movement of water among the living and non-living components of the Earth. What defines this movement? Well, it's going to be how much evaporation we have, as well as how much precipitation we have. That ultimately determines the movement. And those, precipitation and evaporation, go back to our climate. Temperatures, wind patterns, so forth, latitude versus the latitudinal gradient, the altitudinal gradient, and all of that. The soils is where our precipitation falls on the soils. And once it gets to the soils, you're going to have infiltration of the soils. So that's the water integrating themselves into all of those soil particles. We have percolation, which is that water movement down through the soil to get to the reservoir, the aquifers, you can say. We also have sheet flow. So it gets to the point where the soils are saturated, and then all of that leftover water, all right, it's not going down. Maybe the water isn't draining fast enough. It's not percolating fast enough through the soil. So the water, any excess water, then leaves the water, moves across the soils in the form of this sheet flow, and that water then enters your rivers and the streams, travels down the rivers and streams, gets to the oceans and so forth, and then evaporation happens, returning all the moisture up to the clouds and dropping it as rain. So our water, you can have a water molecule that gets evaporated from, let's say here at Lake Nasworthy, only to have that water molecule fall in a place, let's say North Carolina or South Carolina, or perhaps stay up in the atmosphere and come down over in Europe or Asia or someplace else. So the water cycle is a global cycle, and it's going to distribute water globally. In these water systems, we have important physical factors that kind of set the stage for if the organism can survive and live in those areas. All right. Some of the most important factors are here. So oxygen concentration. You might not think about it, but oxygen is what we would consider abundant here in the air. It's easy for us to get to. But in water, oxygen exists at a much lower concentration, because in order for oxygen to be present, it has to dissolve in the water. All right. Once it gets into the water, our diffusion rates through it are also going to be much, much lower than what's in the air. So oxygen availability is inherently lower for aquatic organisms compared to terrestrial organisms. Have organisms figured out a way to adjust to it? Yeah, they have. I mean, you can say life evolved in water, all right, because that allowed them to avoid the water stress. So they had already learned how to handle oxygen. And it's thought that one of the drivers for movement onto land was the more abundant oxygen that's present in the air. The second major important physical factor is salinity. And for this, we can just break it down to, saltwater environments, so the marine environments versus freshwater environments. But then we also have gradients, between that. So you have your rivers where they dump in the fresh water, and you have mixing. So you have this brackish water where it's in between salinity. You have some areas where you have excess evaporation and concentration of the salts, so increased salinity in those areas and so forth. In general, organisms that are adapted to freshwater can't survive in saltwater. Organisms adapted to saltwater can't survive in freshwater. It's in general. It's not universal. And we talked about some of the fish that are able to switch their salt pumps on their gills so that they could survive in both. So oxygen concentration, salinity, and the third one, and it's a big one, is light availability. All right, so for the terrestrial environment, we have plants, photosynthetic organisms that capture sunlight, capture energy from the sun and convert it to sugars, which then powers the rest of the community. All right, it powers, you can say the plants are the power source. They convert that energy, that solar energy, into chemical energy, and then that gets passed up the food chain all the way up until when you die, and then you return that chemical energy back to the soils and those nutrients and so forth. We have the same thing in the aquatic systems. But the aquatic systems have this problem where light can only penetrate so far through the water. So once it gets into the water, light is going to be absorbed and it's going to be scattered by the water molecules that are in there and all the other particles and ions and compounds that are in that water, including organisms. All right, so we get to a point where light is so low in that water column where we can't have any more photosynthesis. That point is called the light compensation point. So it's very similar to our CO2 compensation point, which we talked about, where a CO2 concentration point is that concentration of CO2 where our photosynthesis balances respiration. That's our break-even point. Same concept here. We're at the light level where the energy produced by photosynthesis balances the energy consumed by respiration. So at this point, all right, we're really not going to be effective in growing photosynthetic organisms. And in fact, anything below that point, you won't see photosynthesis. No photosynthetic organisms. Organisms have to have some other method to acquire energy. All right? So in water, we're going to get to this light compensation point. And the level depends on things like turbidity of the water. If you decide to take the oceanography course, I think biological oceanography is taught in the spring. I think that is on the rolls for next semester. You're going to learn about this. All right? Dr. Strength teaches a limnology course. There's something called a Secchi disc that you drop in the water and you see how far down you can still see it. All right? That's an approximation of our light compensation point. And some lakes are really clear. You can see it pretty deep, and that means our light compensation point's going to be much deeper. Some places it's really murky and it gets down to about a foot and it's like, well, I can't see anymore. Our light compensation point's going to be much elevated. This applies to both freshwater and marine environments. But the amount of light that gets down to our depths isn't the only thing that changes. We also have attenuation, which means we have different wavelengths of light getting down to the various depths. And this is what our graph shows. So shallow areas have basically the entire light spectrum. Deep areas, you have filtering out of higher wavelengths of light. All right? So the short wavelengths can penetrate deeper. And what are the shorter wavelengths of lights? Your blues, your greens. So what we see, a consequence of this, is that the algae that grows in these marine environments and in these freshwater environments tend to be specialized on the wavelengths of light in the area in which they live. So you can think of just, let's say, kelp. You know, you've heard of kelp forest before. All right, if you think about a kelp, there's some really long kelp. You've got deep water, you've got shallow water. Those different kelps are going to specialize, they're going to utilize different wavelengths of light for their photosynthesis. And it's a lot like our plants, our terrestrial plants. So as our wavelengths change going into the fall, what happens? The leaves change color. All right? The chlorophyll concentrations change to try to capture the different wavelengths of light that they experience going into the fall. All right? And these are, I mean, we've left off like temperature. We're just going to assume that you can kind of capture temperature. Same rules apply in the aquatic systems as in the terrestrial systems, but in the aquatic systems, these three things are the major drivers or the important physical factors that determine our distribution, species distributions. All right, so what we're going to do is start with our freshwater systems. All right, we're going to start with our freshwater systems, and then we'll end with our marine systems. So in our freshwater systems, I should say, before we get to that, any questions on the physical factors? Give you time to ask that. And again, I think several of you are watching at home. If you have questions, feel free to just put it in the chat. I've got it up. I can periodically see it when I look down. So if we don't have questions, we'll move to our freshwater systems. So our freshwater systems are broadly classified based on water flow. All right, so you've got your streams and rivers, or you have your ponds and lakes. All right, so the lentic systems, those are your ponds and lakes. These are the aquatic ecosystems that are not composed of flowing water. Yes, we have some water flow. We have currents that can develop in these bodies of water, but by and large, that water is basically still. All right? We have wind that can move currents. All right? We'll talk about that. But the water is basically still. It's in a basin. It's in a basin. In these lentic systems, the primary producers tend to be phytoplankton. All right, what's phytoplankton? Who knows what that is? What is phyto? Who's had botany? Anybody here had, oh, we had one that accidentally raised their hand. Take a stab. What do you think phytoplankton is? Okay. Yeah, so plankton are small organisms, microscopic organisms. Phytoplankton, it's our photosynthetic organisms. All right. So phytoplankton in marine environments, oh, there it is. Yep, photosynthetic organisms. They're small organisms. They're going to be floating in the water column. All right. They're just going to float in the water column. And you've seen this. If you've had zoology, all right, you've seen some of these on slides. And I think they had living samples. You take a drop, you put it on. You might not have found them. If you're not comfortable looking on a microscope, you're going to probably find like bubbles and think that that's an organism. And then when you actually do see it, then it's like, oh yeah, now I get it. Now I see it. But these are small planktonic organisms, floating organisms that photosynthesize. And then they provide food source for the zooplankton, which are the microscopic organisms that then feed on them and feed on other zooplankton and so forth. So our rotifers, crustaceans, and so forth. So the phytoplankton, it's a floating algae. We also have aquatic vegetation as well, but the main drivers of the photosynthesis here are the phytoplankton. The Lotic systems, these are the ones that are composed of flowing water, where the water is just constantly flowing. These are the rivers and streams. These are the rivers and streams. The primary producers in these systems is periphyton. All right, so phyto, again, there's our term, but now we have peri, which is on something. So these are the photosynthetic organisms that are on structures. So this periphyton is the aquatic algae that's attached to the structures. The phytoplankton is our aquatic algae that's floating. Periphyton is the aquatic algae that is attached to structures. Those are our primary photosynthetic organisms. And just like our lentic systems, in our streams and rivers, you do have aquatic vegetation. All right, you can have mosses, you can have emergent vegetation, you can have some aquatic plants as well. All right, but our freshwater systems are largely classified by the water flow, and that's important because the main drivers of this photosynthetic production differs. Phytoplankton for the lakes, periphyton for the Lotic systems. Another thing that we should address before we kind of talk about the specific lentic and Lotic systems is that these aquatic systems can't really be studied in isolation. We have to recognize that they are connected to the terrestrial environment. And the question is, how? Well, it's tied to runoff. All right, so our aquatic systems are going to receive rainwater and runoff from the surrounding land, and that's going to cause an input of nutrients, input of organic resources into that system. Those sources of organic material could be classified as either autochthonous or allochthonous. Autochthonous sources are those sources of organic energy derived from photosynthesis within the aquatic system. All right? So autochthonous, auto, it's in our system. Okay. Source of organic energy derived from photosynthesis within the aquatic system. Allochthonous sources are those sources of organic energy that enter the water from terrestrial systems. I'm going to say, generally speaking, lakes and rivers are primarily autochthonous. Most of their organic energy is going to be derived from photosynthesis, from the phytoplankton, from the aquatic vegetation that is in that lake and river. The allochthonous sources tend to be more important for the Lotic systems, for the streams and rivers. And it's not necessarily throughout the river, but it's these sources, these allochthonous sources, that generally drive the communities at our higher elevations at the smaller stream level. So at the sources of these rivers. Because at those places, you might be completely shaded and you won't have a whole lot of primary production that happens. It's dependent on these allochthonous sources. The other thing that's tied to it, so it's not necessarily a clean split between autochthonous and allochthonous, in that rivers or lakes and ponds also receive some of these allochthonous sources. They also have trees dropping their leaves into the pond, producing or providing all of this organic energy. You have runoff taking nutrients from the surface and adding it to these systems. So just remember that as we talk about these aquatic systems, you do have connections to the terrestrial system, and that kind of excludes the whole, well, we have organisms that grow up in the pond and then move to land and so forth. So we're going to start with these Lotic systems. All right, so these are the systems, the streams and rivers. They're defined by flowing water. All right, and in these systems, the rate and the pattern of water flow is probably the most important physical characteristic. All right. This flow is going to be determined by the gradient or the angle of the underlying topography. So how steep is that slope? If we have a steep slope, we're going to have high water flow. If we have shallow slope, we have low water flow. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. All right. At our most extreme is the waterfalls. All right. At the least extreme, you're dealing with lowland rivers where the water just looks completely still. Now, in these systems, we can assign the individual streams and rivers a rank. And this ranking system is called the stream order. All right, so the stream order is a hierarchical position of a stream in a Lotic system based on the number of tributaries that form a stream or river. And I pulled this image off of a website, give you the link. If I don't provide a link or source, usually it's from the textbook or it's provided by the textbook company. All right, so in this system you can see our order, stream order, goes from number 1 and then builds up. So at these sources, at the source of the river, we've got first order streams. They don't have any tributaries. All right, these are by themselves. When you have two first order streams come together, they form a second order stream. Now, a second order stream is defined as only having first order tributaries. All right, so you can be a second order stream and have 100 of these first order tributaries and still be a second order stream. It's only when two second order streams come together where we get our third order. All right, so our third order stream only has second order streams as tributaries. And then we progress down the line. So a fourth order stream only has third order streams as tributaries and so forth. All right. So by this definition, by this process of ordering and ranking our systems, our streams and rivers, we now have a definition of a river. So this is the geographers say that a river is defined as a stream that is at least sixth order. So a sixth order stream only consists of tributaries of fifth order. All right? And those tributaries of fifth order only have their own tributaries of fourth order, and the fourth orders only have third order tributaries, and so forth and so forth and so forth. All right, so we have the stream order, and these stream orders, the different orders, have different communities, and they have different communities because of the processes that happen in our system. All right, so along our river we have a continuum. And this continuum is defined by various ecological and hydrological changes. This is tied to the energy sources in that river. It's tied to the gradients, speed of flow, how much flow, depth of the river, the basin of the river, and so forth. So the river continuum is the ecological and hydrological changes that occur along the course of a stream. So one of that changes is the variation in our sources of energy. And we had kind of mentioned this with our allochthonous and autochthonous sources. So at the headwaters, so at the very source of our stream, most of the energy is provided by allochthonous sources, by sources outside of our system. This is our leaves, our vegetation, all right, our sticks and stuff. That's going to be entering our stream. That's going to provide most if not all of the energy. I'm not going to say all. Most of the energy at that part, at that first order. That energy that's entering is a coarse particulate organic matter, CPON. That is the energy. That energy then gets broken down by the organisms in our system into fine particulate organic matter, FPON. All right, so coarse particulate organic matter, that's what enters the stream. It's at the headwaters, and then our organisms that are in that system are going to be breaking down and utilizing these organic compounds. So we have a lot of coarse organic particles at the headwaters, and then as we move downstream, we're getting finer and finer particulate matter, and that changes what types of organisms we're going to be seeing along this continuum. by the time we make it downstream, most of our energy is going to be provided by the fine particulate organic matters and by autochthonous production by algae. So by the time we start getting down to a little bit slower flow, you're allowing our aquatic organisms, the periphyton, to take hold and start growing and reproducing and start capturing some of that sunlight energy and converting it to chemical energy. So this is variation in energy sources. What about the chemical gradients? Well, we also see a change as we move down our continuum. Oxygen concentration changes. All right, and that has an effect. I mean, that's our law of tolerance. All right, law of tolerance here. So what we see, you generally have a higher content, oxygen content, in these lower order streams. Why is that? Well, it's a couple reasons. One, in those streams, they tend to be smaller. Their volume tends to be less relative to the surface, which means you're going to have more agitation, increased surface area, and agitation leads to increased solubility of oxygen into that water. I guess dissolution would be a better term for that. All right. And the second thing is that these streams, these headwaters, tend to be up at higher elevations, which mean they'll be cooler, they'll be colder. Colder water, by definition, holds more oxygen. So, if we look along the continuum, you're going to have higher oxygen up at the lower order streams, less dissolved oxygen at the lower end. And then if we look at the organisms and look at their oxygen tolerance, you're going to have individuals that really need the higher oxygen living up at the higher order stream, or at the lower order streams, and those that can survive lower oxygen concentrations down at the slower, bigger parts of the river. The second gradient is temperature. And what we'll say is it's usually lower in these lower order streams, and it's usually tied to our elevations. It's not all. Who's been to any of the springs here in Texas, the natural springs? Where'd you go? Put you on the spot. What's that? Okay, there is. How many of you have been to Head of the River Ranch? Have you been in the water at the spring, at the source? What's that water feel like? It's cold. All right, so at some of these streams, this is Head of the River Ranch down in Cristobal. All right, this is still up here. Portrait of bull wares. That's their property. Or their son owns it. It's a family property. All right. So at that stream, that water coming out of the ground is cold. We're not at high elevations. So that's why I kind of say usually it's going to be lower in the lower order streams. And I said it was due to altitude. It doesn't always have to be due to altitude. In this case, it's the groundwater that's coming up. That groundwater is going to be cold. That groundwater coming up from that spring is also pretty much devoid of oxygen too. So at that spot, you're not going to see many organisms living there until oxygen content increases. So yeah, any of those, you probably feel them. Those streams, those springs, they'll be colder. What about nutrient content? Again, nutrient content is usually going to be lower in our lower order streams. And that should kind of make sense because the only thing that's entering into our system are these coarse particulates, coarse particulate organic matter. You're not really going to have a whole lot of photosynthesis. All right? And those coarse particulates all of the nutrients are locked up there. They need time to be released by the organisms, all right? By the invertebrates that are going to feed on them, by the bacteria that break it down, all right? that stuff gets released as we progress down the river, leading to increased nutrient content. The other thing is the watershed area. You know, how much drainage do you have, does that river have? Well, the smaller streams, these first order streams, usually have a very small watershed. The water that enters those areas they don't have time to pick up a whole lot of nutrients. Versus down here where you have all of these small streams that have a small amount of nutrients, well, they keep adding up their nutrients until you get a larger river that does have a lot. All right, so we have a variation in the sources of energy, we have variation in our chemical gradients, and all of that kind of leads to variation in our actual organismal community. All right, so I think the most prominent variation is seen in the macroinvertebrate communities. I think this is what I consider the most interesting part, all right, but you might not be too thrilled with the inverts. So in general, these aquatic systems consist of invertebrates of 4 different types. These are the macroinvertebrates, so things that you can see without really needing a microscope. All right, so we have our shredders, our collectors, our grazers, and the predators. And the distribution of those are going to change along the continuum of the river. So up at our headwaters, where we have a lot of coarse particulates entering our system, the macroinvertebrate community is going to be dominated by our shredders. All right, by our shredders and our collectors. So the shredders are going to take those coarse particulates. It's going to take the leaves, all right, and shred them to smaller pieces. All right, they're breaking it down to these fine particulate organic matters. And then the collectors that are up there are able to catch and filter these fine particulates, further processing them, further releasing nutrients and energy into the aquatic rivers. All right, so the shredders feed on the coarse particulates, they break it down. Examples of this are mayfly larvae, all right? They're shredders, all right? The collectors kind of establish traps of some sort that catch and filter, all right? Macroinverts, caddisfly larvae could do this. Okay. Don't forget the worms. Don't forget your annelids and so forth. All right, and then as we go down, as these coarse and fine particulates kind of switch, as the continuum switches to photosynthesis, then we have transition to collectors and grazers as being the dominant types. So you don't really need the shredders because you're not having a whole lot of these coarse particulates entering our system anymore. All right, they've been broken down. Those objects, the fine particulates, are still available, so you still see the collectors. But now we have the presence of the periphyton that's growing on our rocks and stuff. And stream flow is slowed so that things can grow on the surfaces, on the rocks, the boulders, on any logs that are fallen in that system. These grazers are going to feed on the periphyton and anything else that's attached to those structures. The example that I provide here are the snails. So move away from our insects and go to the mollusks at this point. What you'll see is that our predators basically stay constant distribution. So our predators are going to feed on other invertebrates, on other macroinvertebrates. And that concentration, or their distribution, the percentage of total, tends to stay the same. It's what do they feed on, or what they feed on is what changes. Are they feeding primarily on the shredders? Are they feeding on the collectors? Are they feeding on the grazers and so forth? All right, so our macroinvertebrates change along this continuum. We also see changes in the fish communities. All right? And those fish communities change because of temperature, because of dissolved oxygen, and dominant prey species. So what you typically see are at the headwaters, at the lower order streams, you're going to see fish that require the higher oxygen concentrations, require the cooler temperatures. All right? They're going to be feeding on, let's say, aquatic insects, perhaps some other smaller fish that are feeding on these inverts. And then as we transition down, you're going to have fish that are more adapted, better adapted at the higher temperatures, at the lower oxygen levels, and so forth. And those organisms ultimately, as we get down closer to the mouth of the river, organisms that can handle the fine particulates, that can live in the fine particulates, that can survive in these low oxygen environments. Questions? Give a few moments. So that kind of wraps up our Lotic Systems. And this is kind of where I thought we would get today. Kind of thought we'd get here. So what we're going to do on Monday is talk about the Lotic Systems, the ponds and lakes, and then also hopefully get through the marine system. All right, the marine environment. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of it on Monday. We'll see. We'll see how long it takes us to get through the lakes and rivers. The ponds and the lakes. Jeez. All right. So, we're done. Have a good one. Enjoy the weekend. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.